Good day. The last day or so has seen growing doubts in Britain replace the euphoria that we initially saw following the announcement of the nuclear submarine deal with Australia and the Aukus partnership between Britain, Australia and the United States. And these doubts are reflected by articles which are now starting to appear in the British media, which seem to veer hard away from the initial euphoria which greeted that deal. Now, one article which has appeared is by the long-standing and highly experienced journalist Simon Jenkins, who is perhaps in some ways a somewhat idiosyncratic voice, because even though he continues to write for mainstream media, specifically for The Guardian, he is increasingly unusual and isolated in that he has been a consistent critic and opponent of all of the regime change wars and all of the interventionist experiments that Britain has engaged in since the end of the Cold War. Nonetheless, Simon Jenkins is, to my knowledge, an influential voice. There are people in the British establishment who heed what he says, and he does get quite a lot of attention and coverage in Britain. I would add that his latest article about the Aukus deal is so incisive, though I should stress that I don't agree with everything that he says in it, that I'm going to quote those parts of it with which I do agree, with the important caveat again that I don't always agree with everything that is written there. And it begins with the words, Boris Johnson's military alliance in the Pacific is reckless post-imperial nostalgia. And the article then goes on to say, the Aukus deal, defence deal between Britain, the United States and Australia grows murkier by the day. Essentially, it is the outcome of an industrial dispute over who will build 8 submarines for the Australian Navy. And then he makes, in my opinion, some extremely questionable assertions about the supposed redundancy and obsolescence of submarines, with which I absolutely do not agree. But then he comes to the more important and relevant and incisive points, which are specifically about foreign policy. And he says the following: pompous remarks made for political effect, like sudden alliances and needless snubs, have consequences. Western defence interests, born of the Cold War, refused to let NATO redefine its purpose in the 1990s with the demise of the Soviet Union, which is how Britain got sucked into Afghanistan and Iraq, ostensibly to protect the US from the new threat of terrorism. High rhetoric and military chest beating likewise fueled the preliminaries to the First World War. Britain has no conceivable reason for adopting an aggressive position in the Pacific. It is all arcane post-imperial nostalgia. If the United States is mad enough to return to war in Southeast Asia over Vietnam, it is nothing to do with Britain any more than the Vietnam War was. France, too, claims concerns for its citizens in the Pacific. Europe's second-ranked states seem unable ever to let go of their empires. And then he goes on to say important things like this, specifically that Britain has managed to antagonize its allies in Europe, when in fact Europe is the place where Britain should be mainly concerned. And he finishes, so-called Western diplomacy is currently a disaster area. It has failed to adjust to post-communist Russia, and its handling of the Muslim world has been ham-fisted and tragic. In Afghanistan, the most expensive armies in the world have been sent packing by a fistful of AK-47s. It is half a century since Harold Wilson, British Prime Minister in the 1960s, formally withdrew Britain from east of Suez. Johnson clearly aches to return to prove that he can somehow punch above his weight and put Britain back on the world stage after Brexit. Foreign policy, so vacuously formulated, is reckless. British diplomacy should now be concentrated on Europe, overwhelmingly so. One thing Brexit did not alter was geography. Now, I think there is a great deal here which to me makes sense, and certainly I think the way in which the British have casually fallen into the trap of this alliance in the Pacific with Australia is something which I suspect they will one day come to regret. But as I said, Simon Jenkins is a maverick figure, insightful though I find his articles to be, and influential though in some ways he undoubtedly is. He is not somebody who represents or articulates the mainstream of thinking in Britain on foreign policy. However, the same cannot be said of the Daily Telegraph, which is very much the newspaper of the Conservative Party. It is the newspaper that all Conservative MPs and ministers read every morning, because it articulates thinking very much that amongst Conservatives. And I should say that the Daily Telegraph is absolutely signed up to the Global Britain project, to Britain asserting itself all over the world. It wants Britain to take a strong role against China. It wants Britain to take a strong role against Russia. It tends to support neocon adventures everywhere and wherever they happen. And it takes altogether a completely uncompromising approach to foreign policy. By way of example, it opposed the British-American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which we have just seen. But the Telegraph also is beginning to become a bit nervous, and it's interesting that it has expressed its concerns in an editorial, and its focus is France. And the editorial reads, or at least its headline starts, with the words, "The biggest beneficiary of France's petulance is sitting in the Kremlin." And then it goes on to discuss at some length how the French are acting in a petulant and irresponsible way by not accepting the decision that the British, the Australians, and the Americans have taken to set up Aukus. And they say that it makes critical comments about Emmanuel Macron, a leader who, in the Telegraph's words, likes to project the image of an international statesman, and for whom the Aukus deal is a monumental personal blow. And the Telegraph assures us that the setting up of Aukus was not intended as a snub to France, but President Macron is encouraging the idea that the very honour of the nation is at stake. And then the article, the editorial finishes, "A standoff with Britain is never a bad look for a French politician, though the president has noticeably left much of the harsher rhetoric to his ministers than to indulge it himself. But behind the scenes, he is working to use Albion's alleged perfidy to persuade EU leaders that now is the time to break decisively with NATO by setting up a European army and a common foreign policy. Such a defence construct would, of course, be dominated by France. The biggest beneficiary of this petulance is sitting in the Kremlin." And, of course, what has alarmed the Telegraph and the British establishment is that this French push in response to the announcement of Aukus and to the announcement of the nuclear submarine deal to set up a European army seems to be gaining a certain amount of traction. I say that because over the last few days, we've seen more and more statements from EU officials and EU leaders backing France in this quarrel. In particular, we've seen the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, saying that there's been a lot of open questions that have yet to be answered about the whole initiative to set up Aukus, and that one of our member states, that's obviously to say France, has been treated in a way that is not acceptable. But perhaps even more alarming have been other comments which have been made by German officials. So, for example, we hear that German European Affairs Minister Michael Roth has called the ongoing row a wake-up call for the EU. He says that we cannot exclusively rely on others, but must cooperate, and we have to overcome our differences within the EU and speak with one voice. And he then went on to say that the lost trust has to be rebuilt, and it will obviously not be easy. He doesn't say lost trust with whom, but obviously he means Britain and the United States. But we want to make a constructive contribution to the process. So we see others coming forward and talking in the EU about the fact that the British and the Americans have treated Europe, not just France, badly, and that the moment has come for Europe to stand by itself, to distance itself from the United States, to set up its own military establishment in rivalry and perhaps eventually in substitution for NATO. And that, I think, is the true reason for the nervousness that we see starting to surface in Britain. Because for the British, to be very clear about this, a military establishment in Europe, separate from and ultimately an alternative to NATO, would be a total nightmare. It would marginalise Britain. It would mean that British influence over Europe has finally and completely collapsed, and it would create a military establishment on the European continent, or at least on the western part of the European continent, which would be dominated by France. And the worries that the British would have is that not only would that lead to the collapse of NATO, but as the Daily Telegraph essentially is saying, it would put decisions about European security in the hands of Europeans, notably the French and the Germans, rather than in the hands of the Americans and the British. And given that the French and the Germans are known to want some kind of détente with Russia, after all, it's only a couple of weeks since Merkel and Macron proposed to the European Council that President Putin of Russia should be invited to a European Council meeting and should participate in it, a proposal that some EU states, notably the Netherlands, opposed, but which the Germans and the French might conceivably insist on. Given that the Germans and the French have these ideas, given that they're known to hanker for some kind of reconciliation with Russia, a situation where the French and the Germans, but perhaps especially the French, are the people who make the key decisions about European foreign policy and European security, would be a nightmare for Britain, if only because it is much more likely to result in that reconciliation with Russia, which is what the British most dread. And we see that the Daily Telegraph warns that the biggest beneficiary of French petulance is sitting in the Kremlin. So that's the British nightmare. I'm not, by the way, predicting that is what is going to happen. I continue to be deeply sceptical about this EU army project. I very much doubt that it's going to see the light of day. But the fact is, it's now been given some renewed emphasis by the French, and some of the European states, and notably the Germans, for the moment seem to be playing along. And in any event, they're siding with France against Britain and the United States in this quarrel. and all of that is causing growing unease in London. Now, all of this is happening at the same time as there is growing unease about the entire Aukus project and indeed the whole business of the nuclear submarine deal. Because as I've discussed in previous programs, it's clear that Aukus is not exactly a military alliance, so it's not entirely clear exactly what it is meant to be. Australia, Britain and the United States are, of course, already allies. They're part of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. So Aukus, in that sense, doesn't really add anything, and it doesn't make Australia more of an ally of Britain and the United States than it was previously. Secondly, it's becoming increasingly clear that this project to build nuclear submarines in Australia might not be a realistic one in any realistic time frame. There's growing doubts whether Australia has the technological, industrial and infrastructural capacity either to build or maintain a nuclear submarine fleet, even if it is provided with US and British help. And it could very well be the case that the whole concept of Australia building and operating such a fleet would be unrealizable and unachievable. And again, I've discussed this in another program. So we are now perhaps slipping into what I suspect is not, as some people think, the original intention, but perhaps the default plan, which is that given that Australia cannot perhaps build its own nuclear submarines, and it's unrealistic to think that it can, it's possible that the Australians will do what some people have floated that it might do, which is copy what India did with Russia and lease nuclear submarines from Britain or the United States, just as India has leased and operated nuclear submarines, which it has leased from Russia. And that may indeed be what we see. But I have to say that, again, I see fundamental problems with this. Because if Aukus and this project is supposed to have any meaning or purpose at all, as I discussed in an earlier video, then presumably the intention is to increase the Western naval presence in the Pacific in order to see off the challenge from China. But let us say that either Britain or the United States leases nuclear submarines to Australia. Well, all that will mean is that those nuclear submarines would be redeployed from the US Navy and the Royal Navy to the Royal Australian Navy. The total number of submarines available to these three powers would remain the same. It would just be a change of flags. And given that lots of US Navy submarines operate in the Pacific, I'm not sure quite how that would increase the overall level of military posture. Now, it's been suggested that the British and or the Americans use the money that the Australians would pay to lease these submarines from them to build more nuclear submarines of their own. But I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I doubt, frankly, that Australian funds, money from Australian taxes, would cover the cost of doing that. The United States especially, I would have thought, with its bloated defence budget, can afford to build nuclear submarines without getting the Australian taxpayer to chip in and pay it for them. Perhaps with Britain it would not be the case, but I'm going to say also that I suspect in both Britain and the US's case, and Australia's also, we're probably going to see anyway reductions in overall military spending before very long, because of the fiscal crisis that is emerging in all three countries. The United States, after all, has been running a budget deficit of 15% of GDP for 2 years running now. It is already spending money like there is no limit, and I doubt very much that it can afford to do so either. In Britain, taxes have just been increased to the highest level since 1950. I think the idea that the British should build more nuclear submarines so that they can then send them to Australia to be leased by the Australians, and presumably that will require outlays by the British Treasury to build those submarines. I think that is going to go down like a lead balloon with the British public, and to be straightforward about it, I don't think it's going to happen. And as for Australia itself, I think it is going to find it increasingly difficult to get the Australian public to agree to pay taxes to fund the leasing of nuclear submarines from either the United States or Britain. So I think that this idea of leasing submarines from the British or the Australians is, frankly, somewhat fantastical. I don't see how it increases the defense posture of the West in the Pacific. It seems to me that all it would likely do would be to lumber Australia with further costs at a time when the Australian economy is in increasing difficulties, and when Australia's relations with its biggest trading partner, which is of course China, are now becoming rocky, to say the least. So I'm sceptical about this plan as well. And then, of course, there is the other suggestion, which you also hear, which is that the real purpose of Aukus is to enable the United States to open many more bases in Australia, including bases for nuclear submarines in Australia. And the implication here is that if Australia does lease submarines from the United States, because Australia does not have the skilled personnel to operate or maintain these submarines, it will have to draw on the US for help to do that, and that will mean that these will be Australian submarines in name only, because they will be operated with the assistance of American personnel based in Australia, located in Australian ports, and with the United States, in effect, controlling the operations of these submarines. Now, that is, by the way, a perfectly legitimate point to make about this project. The British, for example, have found that it is very difficult for them to operate the Queen Elizabeth carrier by itself, though the Queen Elizabeth has been sailing around the Pacific. Much of its carrier group, air carrier group, consists of F-35 fighters borrowed from the US Marine Corps and operated by US Marine Corps pilots. So this would not be a radical shift or dramatic shift from that position if the Australians did the same thing. But here's the thing. If the United States wants to negotiate basing arrangements in Australia, if it wants to use Australian ports and establish more bases in Australia, well, I suspect that it could probably have done it anyway. And if it needed to agree with the Australians that the Australians would have some kind of overall control over US submarines based in Australian ports, or if the Australians insisted that the only such submarines that could operate in Australian ports were submarines which were American in all but name, but which flew the Australian flag, well, I suspect that all of that could have been negotiated and agreed, and Australia could have come up with a much better deal than the one it has achieved at the moment. But more to the point, it could have been done in a much more open way, and one which did not involve antagonizing France. I'm not convinced anyway that this is the real plan, that this was ever the real plan. I would have thought that if the United States really did want to operate nuclear submarines from Australian ports or to open more bases in Australia, it has quite a few bases in Australia already, I suspect that the present Australian government would, after a certain amount of arms twisting and tough negotiation, have gone along with it. I don't see why the United States needed to pretend that this was all some kind of new dramatic deal for the United States to supply nuclear technology to Australia so that Australia could operate nuclear submarines, and why all this had to be negotiated in secret, and why the French had to be antagonized in that way. I can't help but think, yet again, that the real reason why we're hearing ever more about these, I think, rather far-fetched plans about leasing submarines and creating bases in Australia, and these ideas about Australia operating submarines, which are really, to all intents and purposes, American submarines, is that having come up with this dramatic announcement the other day, and perhaps somewhat dismayed by the international reaction, the Australians, the British and the Americans are suddenly discovering that the announcement that they made is not actually a realistic one, that Australia doesn't have the capacity to build or operate these submarines, and rather than admit as much, they're now frantically looking for means and ways to make this announcement seem more thought through and more structured and credible than it actually is. In other words, you first announce something and then you go away and think about what you're actually going to do in order to give the appearance of reality to that which you have already announced. That seems to me to be very much the pattern at the moment of British, American and Australian diplomacy. And of course, most especially the diplomacy of Britain and of the United States. And again, I come back to this point I have made already. All of this, these inconsistent statements, this constant shifting of what this announcement really is all about, all of this suggests to me a very amateur, a very ill thought out, very unstructured form of decision making in these various capitals. It looks as if a group of leaders, Biden, Johnson and Morrison, came together like three public schoolboys and came up with a big announcement which they thought would grab lots of headlines and which would establish them as great statesmen taking decisive steps in the Pacific to take on the Chinese dragon. And what they have realized, or are starting to realize, at least in the case of the British and the Americans, is that they greatly underestimated the impact of this announcement in Europe and are starting to have at least nerves about that, and also that the Australian part of the announcement doesn't really add up either. Well, I have to say, I find this really rather sad, but very typical. It all suggests to me, as I said, policy made on the hoof by people who aren't really thinking and planning things through properly and who aren't consulting properly. And I come back to a point I made previously. So much of the trouble with this announcement would have been avoided if there'd been broader discussion and broader consultation about what it meant and what it was intended to do. Now, I've seen some of the comments in the threads, in the threads to my previous programs, with people being very critical of the French and ridiculing the idea of French participation in Aukus. And I have to say, I do question that. After all, France has been, in general, a loyal, if not always an easy ally of the United States and Britain. It's not always easy to pick one's allies, and sometimes allies have minds of their own. But I can't say that for the last 30 years or so, the French have acted in any way that is generally disloyal, and I would have thought that if they'd been approached and consulted and talked to about this and offered a part in the Aukus plan, well, they would probably have accepted and something could have been arranged and a lot of the damage and harm that we've seen would have been avoided. And the British would not now be fretting about the possibility of a European army, chimerical though I happen to think that is, and the Australians and the British and the Americans would not be trying to make up some kind of project to make the nuclear submarine announcement real and practical instead of fantastical and unrealistic, which is what it looks at the moment. But there it is. That is policy. That is how policy is made at the moment. Anyway, the net effect of all of this is that I doubt that anything has been done and anything has been agreed which is going to change the strategic balance in the Pacific. All the countries in the Pacific region, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, are all looking at this askance, wondering what the Americans are up to, wondering why the British are even involved, annoyed about the privileged role the Australians are getting, and at the same time questioning whether there's anything there that really changes the existing military balance in the Pacific in any meaningful way. So, as a pitch in the Pacific, I don't think this has done any good there at all. Australia has been landed with a commitment to build and operate nuclear submarines, which I predict is going to become increasingly burdensome and increasingly expensive, and which is probably not going to turn out well for Australia, and which might, for all I know, be cancelled some way down the line. Britain now finds itself concerned about the fact that the French are now seizing the initiative to press for this European army, marginalising Britain in its military position in Europe and conjuring up the spectre of the French and the Germans eventually doing that deal with the Russians, which is London's great strategic nightmare. And the Biden-Harris administration, which came into office saying that it was going to strengthen America's alliances, now finds that it has instead weakened them. Well, I called all this a debacle a few days ago in a programme which I did. I said that it is a debacle that is gradually emerging. With every day that passes, that seems to me to be even more clear. As of this moment in time, I suspect that the people who are looking upon these events and this announcement with increasing pleasure are those hard-headed, tough-minded people in Moscow and Beijing who are purposefully and systematically and methodically making their plans. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today, covering this Aukus decision. I suspect this will be the last program on this subject for some time, though maybe the French will do something with their European army idea, which will nonetheless interest us. Well, we shall see. In the meantime, I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, and where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Also, please remember to check us out on our new platforms. And here I specifically refer to Locals, where Alex and I are uploading a great deal of exclusive content. I'm doing many videos now which appear exclusively on Locals. Shortly, very shortly, be doing live streams. Wait for that announcement. And in addition, you will be seeing us doing more things there, and where, by the way, all sorts of people who decide to become active members are able to upload and produce their own content. So if you want to join all of that, you're very welcome to do so. I think you will find it a wonderful and attractive thing for yourself, and you will learn a great deal from it. And I hope you will also be able to participate actively in all sorts of good ways. And of course, we're also present on other platforms like SuperU, and also BitChute, Library, Odyssey, and Rumble. And if you want to support us, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And you can also go to our shop and support us there by buying our famous Duran magic mugs, for example, like this one that I have with the Australian flag, and others with hats and hoodies and stickers and t-shirts and all the rest. And also, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, thank you again for joining me today on what, as I said, I expect will be my last program on Aukus, at least for a while. And I look forward to you joining me again, and have a wonderful day until then.